But now the county supervisors have the final say, and they could override the planning commission back there. So Brad has asked for our help and the help of other roundtables in sending emails to the county supervisors there, explaining that historical preservation and tourism for the purposes of visiting battlefield sites are of benefit to the people of Virginia. And so, unless there's strong opposition, we plan to send an email in support of that principle because, you know, if there's no battlefield site, it's really not worth visiting a solar power plant as far as your tourism or historical research. So that's something that came up this week that we wanted to let you know about, and we'll be sending an email after the meeting in support of preserving the land and relocating the solar power project to something that is not a historic site, which is really the whole point. Building the solar power project is great, but don't build it on top of something that otherwise should be preserved.
That's in Culpeper, right, Nick?
Yes. And so that's really the whole point, is that it's not just that one. There have been several other similar projects. Some of you may remember when Disney wanted to build an amusement park on one of the other battlefield sites. So this is not a new conflict back in Virginia. Just the specific project is new. So anyway, I will now hand it over to Michael to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Nick. It's my pleasure tonight, and I'm exceedingly pleased to announce that we actually have two presenters tonight instead of one. We have Thomas Jefferson, who many of you may know as our third president, and I think I will limit his introduction to what he put on his epitaph that he chose himself, which is that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. Our second presenter will be Bill Barker. Bill Barker is recognized as the world's foremost interpreter of Thomas Jefferson, and I'm confident that you will agree after this evening that he has been able to capture not only the essence of the man, Thomas Jefferson, but also an understanding of the time and context in which Jefferson lived. And that's, I think, critical to understanding, particularly tonight's topic as slavery, because we have such a different view of slavery today than everyone had at the beginning of the country right up to the Civil War. And I can say that having seen Bill perform, I was a young lad when I first saw him perform, and I will tell a story. He was giving a presentation as Thomas Jefferson, not getting out of character. Tonight we're fortunate because upon Mr. Jefferson's conclusion of his remarks, we will be joined by Bill Barker, who will answer questions about Thomas Jefferson as well as other historical questions that the audience might have. But at this instance, he gave a riveting monologue as Mr. Jefferson, and I was enraptured by it. And then he would open it up to questions, and he did not get out of character. And one question was, a lady in the audience asked him if he thought it was appropriate that he have sexual relations with one of his slaves. And Mr. Jefferson kind of pulled back a little bit. There was a nice pause, and he said, "A gentleman would never have such a discussion with a lady." And I think that's all we're going to hear about Sally Hemings tonight. So if that's your interest, then I think you are going to be disappointed. However, you will not be disappointed in the presentation on slavery in America. And you will find Bill's presentation to be riveting, as I have. And you should know that Bill has presented as Thomas Jefferson around the world. He's made his presentation as Thomas Jefferson in the White House, at the U.S. Capitol, even the Palace of Versailles, and the Las Vegas Strip. So, and of course, just about every network. He's been on television as well as countless publications. So as the foremost interpreter of Thomas Jefferson, we're very fortunate to have Bill, and I think you will find that his interpretation of Jefferson will be as close to a time machine as any of us will ever experience. So with that, oh, by the way, he also has done Thomas Jefferson at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, his hometown, and he was lured away from Independence Hall by Colonial Williamsburg, where he performed for many years, and then he was lured from Colonial Williamsburg to Monticello. Monticello, and I encourage and invite everyone to visit the monticello.org website, which is linked up on our website, as a absolutely phenomenal place to visit. And now you would also have the experience of seeing Mr. Jefferson at his home, as Bill performs at Monticello on a regular basis and lives in the area of Monticello, which is near Charlottesville, Virginia, the home of the University of Virginia. So with that, I will turn the forum over to Mr. Jefferson.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Odanino. I can only say that listening to your commentary on an individual by the name of Barker escaped me entirely with any knowledge of that individual. However, your comments upon how I should like to be remembered, your statement that I have already decided that I should like to be known as the author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia, is one to beguile me, only because I have never made that public. I will not deny, drawn up a design for a tombstone that I would wish to have erected over my grave, a granite cube 4 foot square upon which might be placed an obelisk 6 feet high, and yes, a marble tablet with that inscription upon it, not one word more, because by those 3 as testimonials I have lived, I wish most to be remembered. But Mr. Odanino, I keep that within an envelope in my bed table drawer. And if anyone knows about it, I have not heard, with one exception, my daughter, Mrs. Randa, to whom I said after I breathed my last, please open the envelope and follow the instructions accordingly. Now, I can only imagine that the reason you may know something about this is through the extraordinary medium by which we are all meeting this evening. I dare say I've heard over 3,000 miles we can gather. This is what I would consider to be representative of the founding principles of our nation. I've always said the greatest product our nation has to offer the rest of the world is imagination. And if we can conceive it, if the mind of man can conceive it, well, here we are all gathering this evening in that imagination. I welcome it. I welcome any opportunity for immediate information to be shared and disseminated as far as it can possibly be, and everyone to be able to hear, to inform themselves, enlighten themselves, and engage themselves in the public conversation. Never forget, these are founding principles. And particularly upon the subject we are going to engage in conversation tonight. When you invited me, Mr. Richardson, Mr. Odanino, to discourse upon the American Civil War, well, I can only say I have only known of 2. That Civil War that preceded my birth 100 years. The English Civil War. When we talked of Civil War before the 1770s, that is what we brought to mind, what we discussed. And remember, Virginia was settled by many cavaliers who escaped England with the usurpation of power by General Cromwell, came to Virginia. And as you remarked upon the university, I understand that they are now renowned by a nickname, the Cavaliers. So it follows a historical account. But as I said, that Civil War was only known up to the 1770s. Because in the 1770s, early thereupon, our families were beginning to divide. Brother was having dispute with brother at the family meal table. My own family, the Randalls, were dividing as to our loyalties. Loyalties unto the crown, 3,000-4,000 miles away, or loyalties unto us as a Virginian, let alone loyalties unto our sister colonies. We were all born British, and yet we were born very different here in the British colonies than our ancestors or our brethren in the British Empire, particularly in Great Britain. We began to look upon ourselves as Virginians, Pennsylvanians, those from Massachusetts, Jersey, the Carolinas, and Georgia. We were settling way beyond the line of demarcation that had been set up by George III after the end, if you will, of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War amongst the kingdoms of Europe. We were prohibited to do so, but we had already claimed lands there. And once the French were allowed to return, that Quebec Act, if you will, of 63, well, then we could not help but settle there the farther. And here's another thing, as I mentioned, the French. We were also brought up to realize that very different from our English brethren back in Great Britain, we were here amongst a people that had already been here before us. We were brought up to know before the English claimed North America, the French had claimed. And before the French claimed North America, the Spaniards had claimed. And then, of course, we all knew that the natives of this continent had been here however long before any European arrived. This was no less in our minds a representation of America and Americans. And I was born under that old regime. I was born under the old habits, customs, and laws of that regime. And in this particular year of 21, I do believe it is the year 21, is it not? 18 and 21, I have made note, Monticello, that more and more are seeking our new nation to come here and settle than we've ever known before. The population of our nation now, with the 24 states, the 24th to enter this summer of 21, the population is near 10 million. And those who are coming here are discovering that population into which I was born. My parents were born, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. But if as I have said, that does not make me any the more American than any coming here to live their lives. And as they come here, discovering the population I've always known, the natives I have referred to, red, white, and black. That is who we have been. That is who we continue to be. And with so many more coming here, it just increases that remarkable diversity of our population, but so it should. Because we are the first nation in the history, man, to be founded upon principles, not upon monarchy, nobility, royalty, aristocracy, special privileges. Principles argued and debated from time immemorial as to whether man is capable of self-government. This is why we are world-renowned. This is why you are here. I make these statements introductory that we might not forget what we were able to achieve as the 1770s dawned, something that England never, ever wanted to have happen. We showed the rest of the world within time, particularly in 1774, long before the Declaration was written, long before the first shots at Lexington and Concord, that we could bring 13 individual nations together e pluribus unum. I pause and I ask you, how did we do that? Each one of those 13 colonies were distant, disparate, one from the other, in the degree of religious opinion in one versus a vast difference in the other, in the degree of freeholders living in one versus the greater number of tenants living upon the freeholdings in another. And mind you, upon the subject this evening, there was slavery in every single one of them. England wanted to keep us distant and disparate. She wanted to keep us arguing and bickering amongst ourselves. Why? Well, read your Machiavelli. That's right. Divide and conquer. It's common sense. But it's also common sense to realize 2 heads are better than 1, 3 heads better than 2, 13 heads collectively are most desirable for the common safety, common defense, and the common good. This is how we made the initial reconciliation. This is why when in Virginia we learned of the closure of the port of Boston in the spring of 1774, we would not sit idly by. Though she was 600 miles away in Massachusetts, we came to her aid and we called for an American Parliament. Not to have it the way they want up north in Massachusetts, not to have it our way in Virginia, but midway, between the North and the South, in the largest city in North America, Philadelphia. I had hoped to go there to that first Congress convening September of 74. I fell ill, but in my illness, I was invited by my cousin, Peyton Randolph, Speaker of the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, who would be going to Philadelphia, and he would be elected the first president of that Continental Congress. By his invitation, I drew up a summary view of the rights of British America, that it might be brought up there in my absence. Cousin Peyton would have it printed up in the city of Philadelphia, distributed amongst all of the delegates there. And with respect to this evening's subject, I make this reiteration. I speak this particular few sentences from my summary view of the rights of British America only because in Virginia, 6 years earlier, when I was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, elected to represent Albemarle County, 120 miles to the west from Williamsburg, Virginia, that my very first action in public office was to stand that spring of 68 and call for permission, merely to permission, to begin a debate towards ending the importation of slaves to Virginia. Who would know better how this was continuing to grow to an extent that we could not possibly be able to harness it or to tend to it, that it would become overwhelming in time. Not only was it morally wrong, the political economy did not support it. Curious to many of us, we knew at the time I was elected in 68 that the first laws to establish slavery in North America were in Massachusetts Bay. But there was no necessity for it up there. Very simply, it's colder. There's no long growing season. There's not the attention to cultivate large plantations over a longer period of time. And so instead, they were able to institute a wage-earning economy, pay a wage for any degree of labor, and then the monies you receive in return, the hard monies, you will spend, particularly in the company store, and that to accrue more and more money in kind. Lamentably, how much we know that a great deal of this expenditure was invested in the further importation of slaves to the southern colonies, particularly supported by the Royal African Company. Therefore, we were beholden to it for several generations. And I spoke out that first session, never thinking it would be the beginning of 40 years in public service. My summary view was welcomed in Philadelphia. It was printed up and distributed amongst many there. And I quote, if you will, here is the pamphlet itself, stating a summary view of the rights of British America set forth in resolutions intended for the inspection of the present delegates of the people of Virginia now in convention. My name does not appear. It says simply by a native and member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. And perhaps this is the reason, because if you may acquire a copy, they're still available. On the bottom of page 16, running to the top of 17, I quote, for the most trifling reasons, and sometimes for no conceivable reason at all, His Majesty has denied laws of the most salutary tendency. The abolition of domestic slavery is the general desire of those colonies in which it first began. But previous to the freeing of the slaves we have, it is necessary to cease any further importations. And yet our repeated attempts to effect that by prohibitions, by petitions, by duties which might amount to a prohibition, have repeatedly received His Majesty's negative. I'll never forget the many who will want to accuse me of being an upstart from the wilderness, a turncoat to his class. Well, I've never let him down. My cousin returned from Philadelphia. He told me many wanted to know who is the author of this summer review. He said he replied to him, my cousin Thomas Jefferson from Albemarle in Virginia, and they replied to him that autumn of 1774, please tell Mr. Jefferson he's become well renowned as an author, even in his absence. It was the next spring with the Second Continental Congress that I was invited once more to go to Philadelphia. I went there with my cousin Peyton Randolph again. And in that particular spring of 75, you may remember that as we heard of the action taken in Lexington and Concord, and 2 weeks later in Williamsburg, Virginia, the action of the Crown to deprive the freeholders of their arms. Now, not their private arms that they held in their houses, those necessary for making livelihood and hunting, their safety and defense. These were the arms supplied by the Crown. These were the arms and the munitions that were in the government arsenals. And that is what His Majesty's troops sought to deny and take. When we heard about this in Philadelphia, we knew it was time to decide to take up arms ourselves, arm ourselves. And I was invited to a committee to draft the necessity for taking up arms. It was rather harsh, I'm not going to deny. In fact, the first draft was given to Mr. Dickinson to more or less smooth out, to make it a bit more ameliorating. And then, as if they slapped my wrist, they asked me to write an olive branch petition, actually suggesting a reconciliation, a compromise. And so we sent them both to Parliament. The necessity to take up arms, the olive branch petition, and well, I would ask if we were all together there here in person, you remember their reply that winter of 75 and 76? No necessity to think overly upon the subject because there was no reply, except what we read in the British newspapers. I quote, "These colonies are now officially in a state of rebellion." This was not before the Royal Governor of Virginia, John Merle, Earl of Dunmore, decided to incite a rebellion amongst the enslaved in Virginia, to welcome them to take up arms against their master and to join the British forces. Some did, not many. And we continued to arm ourselves and be prepared for war. It may not be known by many of you on the subject of the whole element, foundation of slavery, relegated to one particular color. That I had actually been called previous as an attorney practicing in Virginia to defend a slave, one who had run away from his master, one who was the grandson, if you will, of a white woman begotten with child by a Negro father. By the law of 1709, any white woman begotten of child by an Indian or Negro father would suffer the child to become a ward of the Church of England for 21 years. Now, of course, if you were the child at 21 years, you were free. But I ask you this, what about if the child was female and that young girl herself found herself begotten with child before she was 21 years old? Well, let's make another law for it, and indeed, we did in Virginia. 1723, any child born of a mulatto or Indian woman serving 21 years of servitude would themselves serve 21 years of servitude. So you may understand therein how the sins of the mother will want to have its effect for successive generations. Now that would end with a male, or a boy would, at 21 years, be free. But the Church of England did not care to have that happen. And when the grandson of the white woman initially, one Samuel Hale, before 21 years of age, was sold to one Wade Netherland. Sam Hale knew the law. He knew what injustice had been done to him, and he ran away from Mr. Netherland. He was captured, ran away a second time. He was captured the second time, and Mr. Netherland wanted his money back. Mr. Netherland came to George Wythe in Williamsburg, under whom I read law, and asked for the prosecution. Mr. Wythe invited me to stand the defense for Sam Hale. This case was tried before the General Court in the Capitol building in Williamsburg. And in Sam Hale's defense, I argued two foundations. First and foremost, that the acts of slavery, any contract drawn up thereupon, go back to the initial capture, the initial acquiring of these slaves amongst the kingdoms of Africa. And that whenever the slave then sets foot on the soil of North America, a tabula rasa, these contracts are invalid. Most importantly, secondly, is I quoted the Justinian Code of Law, that first civil body of law, provided in the 6th century by Roman Emperor Justinian I, the foundation of which is simply everyone is born free. Everyone comes into this world with a right to their own person, to move wherever they choose, to make for their own livelihood. As I began that citation, the gentlemen justices, that is the 12 men who were appointed by the royal governor, of course, John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, as they knew exactly what I was referring to, they brought down their gavel, requesting me to be silent, and found favor for Mr. Wythe's client. I'm only happy to say that though Sam Hale was returned to the Church of England, within a year he ran away again and no one ever heard anything more from him. The reason I reflect upon this, at the time I was to mention the influence of the extension of the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the spring of 1776, is because of the invitation to me to join a committee appointed by President John Hancock, a committee of 5 men, to draft a Declaration of American Independence. The foundation of that declaration in the first 2 paragraphs is indeed that same Justinian Code of Law. And remember, too, this is a reference to the Summary View of the Rights of British America. That Summary View included the essence of the English common law, the right of an Englishman to seek redress for grievances, the right of an Englishman to protect and defend himself, the right of an Englishman to put forth his opinion freely. The committee to draft the Declaration of American Independence was an afterthought, because the first object, that first part of June 1776, was to create a motion upon the resolution of Virginia. The fact that on the 15th of May, 1776 in Williamsburg, Virginia became the first of all of the colonies to pronounce herself free and independent on behalf of her sister colonies. Rhode Island had sought nearly a month before, in April of 76, to pronounce herself independent, but it was only unto herself. And mindful of this too, Newport, Rhode Island, was one of the centers of the importation of slaves in North America. But in May of 76, Virginia became the first to declare an independency on behalf of her sister colonies. That resolution was brought up to Philadelphia, read by my kinsman, Colonel Richard Henry Lee, provoking an immediate consternation. President Hancock created the entire Congress as a committee of the whole, and then appointed that committee of 5 men to draft a declaration should it be necessary. It was not a fait accompli. When you reflect on the 5 people on that committee, Mr. Adams from Massachusetts, Mr. Sherman from Connecticut, Mr. Livingston from New York, Dr. Franklin, Pennsylvania, would realize I was the only one on that committee south of the line drawn by Messrs. Mason and Dixon, representing Virginia. Dr. Franklin was assumed to be the one to take up the pen, but he turned down the invitation. He looked at me the same time Mr. Adams did, and it was Adams who said, I believe Jefferson writes as well as anyone else, and a Virginian ought to be at the head of this business. Because the business began in Virginia, in Williamsburg, with that resolution for independence. I turned to write that declaration with nothing new or original. It wasn't our business to come up with anything new or original. It was rather to express in clear and simple terms what has already been written in the elementary books of public right, the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon, Sidney, John Locke. Those books I assume everyone has read and reread frequently. No, reflect a moment. In 1776, many Americans could not read. I had to shed the lofty sophisms. I had to write something that could be publicly read, and to write something in 3 particular parts with a Shakespearean cadence to lift the human spirit to noble sentiments, what man can accomplish in improving the condition of his fellow man. The first part I mentioned, the essence of the Justinian Code. Everyone is born free. We all come into this world with a right to our own person. That is the essence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And property is that essence of the Justinian Code. The first and foremost property is the right to yourself. You cannot deny that to another. Everyone understood exactly what this meant. The second part of our declaration is to remind us that we are all born free in nature. We're born into the laws of man. There's the contradiction. But there's never been a better opportunity in human history to rectify that in the creation of our remarkable nation. And the third part, the most important part, in my opinion, is the compact. The compact in perpetuity. That last line, gentlemen, is recited frequently, is it not, around the world in many lodges. And in support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It is not generally known that when I returned to Williamsburg that fall of 1776, I went immediately to work on a revision of the monarchical code of law under which I was born and grew up. 126 revisions, assisted by Mr. George Wythe, I mentioned earlier, under whom I read law, Mr. Edmund Pendleton. Bill 21 dissolved primogeniture and entail. That bill, if you will, to dissolve that which I benefited from. I was the eldest son in a family of 10 children. And when my father passed away at 49 years of age, under the British laws of primogeniture, primo first, genitor family, I inherited all his property. Nearly 3,000 acres and all the families residing thereupon. Bill 82 is the bill for religious freedom, nothing like it in human history, in defending the liberty of one's own mind. Hold your opinion upon religion as you choose, or hold no opinion upon the subject. Bill 79 for a universal system of education that can be attended to by the poor as well as the wealthy, the female as well as the male. That is the only way we're going to be able to hold on to the reins of self-government and hold together our union. Ignorance is not bliss. An educated citizen body will always be the safest, the best defender. Those gentlemen freeholders, the white male freeholder, 21 years of age or older, who through this year, 1821, is the only American who has a vote. Who has a vote in our population of nearly 10 million. 6% have the vote and a voice in our government. But my point, gentlemen, we know well if your family has the means, education will always prove the true corrective for the abuses of any authoritative power. And the reason simply is because we are familiar with the facts. That is our learning. That is the education. To understand what does not happen overnight, but what has accrued from time immemorial. No one will be able to pull the wool of ignorance over your eyes to a mistrust of your own vision. And if it appears that I'm skirting the particular subject of this evening's discussion, that's because Bill 51 was my bill to end the importation of slaves to Virginia and to allow a master to free all of his people. when we were still subjects of the British Empire, a law of 1723 said that a master could only free one slave per year relative to meritorious service shown to the family, that they might have saved them or been of some cure to a malady. More than 50 years through the beginning of our American Revolution, many of us have not forgotten 16 were freed under that law. My bill allowed a master to free all, but it certainly did not give an end to that means. The bill actually passed, but it passed with the idea there would continue to be amendments to it and addendums to it, realizing that the landed gentry, self-proclaimed, the white male freeholder, would now have the opportunity, if required, a support for the enslaved to be manumitted. And from that time, as it continues, many have considered me a red-breeched radical revolutionary seeking to extricate their own property, and they are correct. And lamentably, too, you might realize in this year 21, many of them share my particular fate. We're beholden to creditors. And we can satisfy our creditors, surely. But think about it. I wonder who thinks about them. All of the families intermarried, familiar with them our entire lives, born here in this vicinage. Where do you begin? I've written, I will not sell my people. I will not sell my family. I wrote in the Declaration of American Independence amongst our grievances that His Majesty was indeed a tyrant for capturing a poor people, bringing them halfway about the globe and subjecting them to indentured servitude for life. Would that you could read that in our declaration as it was resolved and printed on the morning of the 5th of July in the Pennsylvania Gazette and in the broadside handed out. It's not there. It's not there because of a compromise we had to make in order to realize how we wanted the rest of the world to understand what we had done. On the morning of the 4th of July, I thought that the Declaration would be voted upon unanimously, with the exception that one of the delegates from South Carolina stood up and said, so long as that particular clause remains in there, South Carolina will not offer its vote to make this unanimous. And this was after that very same delegate, as we began our arguments and debates upon the Declaration, stated clearly that the final vote on the Declaration should be unanimous only because the vote upon our Declaration fell one short. Lewis Morris from New York declined to vote. He wanted to go back to New York, receive further instructions, and yes, he did return, do not forget, by mid-July, and he did vote in favor of our independence. But no, the gentleman from South Carolina knew exactly what he was construing, and he was supported and seconded by a gentleman from Georgia. At that moment, I got out and walked out of the Congress. Many to this day have said, Mr. Jefferson, why did you not stay and defend your work? I could not, nor could one member of the Committee of Five. The reason simply, we abided by parliamentary procedure. Once my work was over, I turned the draft to the committee. That was it. No further say. The committee had their say, particularly Adams. He had a lot of alterations to engage. But then, once the committee finished their alterations, they handed the Declaration to the larger delegate body. In fact, Mr. Trumbull, Jonathan Trumbull, has symbolized that in his great painting, hangs in the rotunda of our Capitol. Many consider it the signing of the Declaration. No, it is not. It is the work of the committee. The work of the committee, proper parliamentary procedure. And once then in the hands of the larger delegate body, it was out of our hands. We had no further say. And of course now, as Mr. Trumbull wants, gazing upon that great painting with its heroic theme, it shows the Declaration is in our hands. After the victory of our American Revolution, our Congress met in Annapolis the spring of 1784. I was asked in that Congress to chair a committee to write a report on the Northwest Territories. And so it was, the committee drew up a report that I more or less authored, now owning those territories in the Northwest. How do we admit the territories into our union as new states? I wrote up 5 requisites. Firstly, every territory becoming a state of our union will forever remain a state of our union. Secondly, every territory becoming a state of our union will have its government in Republican forms as the other states and the federal government. Thirdly, every territory becoming a state of our union will have a portion of the national debt apportioned on it as it can afford to pay. No need for a Hamiltonian plan of assumption that we'd later faced. Pay as you go along. The Hamilton plan, of course, is purposeful to create the debtor and creditor. Fourthly, no one holding any hereditary title will be admitted a citizen of our nation. We will nip aristocracy in the bud. And fifth, to our general interest this evening, by the year 1800 of the Christian era, there shall no longer be any indentured servitude in any of the states or the territories annexed to it. This was put up to vote. It required 2 delegates to represent each one of our states at that time. We were still the 13th. And it lost. But please do not forget it lost by 1 vote. It is said that the delegate from New Jersey was home ill that evening. I wrote the next morning, the heavens clouded over our young nation and the destinies of unborn millions was made. Oh, they were quick to suggest that Mr. Jefferson be commissioned our nation's minister plenipotentiary to the court of King Louis XVI of France to succeed Dr. Franklin. But they could not ignore the fact that the vote on the report for the Northwest Territories was so dire with just 1 vote. And so it was recreated, the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. And though some from Massachusetts want to suggest that a representative named Dane, D-A-N-E, was responsible for inserting that slavery clause, please, citizens, my good friend, Mr. Edward Coles, who was born and grew up along with his brother Isaac at a neighboring plantation, Enniscorthy. Well, the 2 of them, of course, beleaguered me with what more I could do in my advanced age to bring about an end to slavery. I said, it is on your shoulders, gentlemen. And Edward Coles then took his inheritance, went up to Illinois, so it became a state, and there freed his enslaved. He later moved to Philadelphia, and I understand that the Historical Society of Pennsylvania asked him to write his reflections and his memory on what he recalled of that Northwest Ordinance of 1785, and he distinctly said it was James Monroe who reinserted that slavery clause, that it be part of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 when we met to create our Constitution. It's important to remember I was not there during that Constitutional Convention. I was still serving in France. I kept in constant correspondence with Mr. Madison. I believed that the Articles of Confederation were a venerable fabric. They ought not to be tampered with. But I knew distinctly there was no efficient method of electing the Chief Magistrate of our nation, nor to raise taxation for the defense of our nation. But it was Madison, the most luminous mind I've ever known, knowing more about ancient history, what's gone wrong, and what we can benefit from in our modern world. Madison, who sent me that first draft of the Constitution in a letter November 1787 that changed my mind. I wrote back to him, I'm captivated by it. This is the shortest document of its kind in human history, creating a government to check its own power. And of the 3 particular branches, the most influential, the most important, the legislative branch. That branch elected by the people, elected by the white male freeholder, 21 years of age or older. But what I said will support the very first line of the Constitution. What is so very necessary for this Constitution to grow as we grow as a people. Again, this is for common sense. A child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. Our laws and institutions must grow as we grow as a people. What it needs is a Bill of Rights. That is what all people upon the globe are entitled to, against any government upon the globe. Mr. Madison retaliated. He said, we do not need a Bill of Rights. All of it is inferred in the Constitution. And I wrote back, do you mean to tell me we're going to rest upon inference on such an important subject as the inalienable rights of man? He then saw the light. I'm happy to say that I changed his mind on one particular subject, and he has remained ever since, though considered an ardent Federalist first. Ever since, he has remained a democratical Republican. But the point to remember about our Constitution, though I was not there and though I had some influence, is the simple fact it itself was the result of a compromise. A compromise that does not answer the future of our subject this evening, in my mind, so long as I live. A compromise that has made many of us look upon the future with a respect to those generations yet unborn, that they might discover a method to reconcile this barbarous commerce of slavery. I can only tell you that when I returned from 5 years in France, took up the commission as our nation's Secretary of Foreign Affairs, becoming the Department of State, even though in argument with our Secretary of the Treasury and resigning from that office, those who began to follow the Democratical Republican platform invited me to return and stand for the highest office, first in '96, and then having lost and suffering the office of Vice President, which, when you talk about amendment to the Constitution, happily we did amend, because originally written it said whoever receives the second highest number of votes becomes Vice President. Now, the 12th Amendment brought that first vice presidential election into its regard in 1804. And this was after, happily, the presidential election of 1800. But I can tell you, and please do not forget, that immediately taking up the office of president of our nation, I continued with my efforts to bring to justice any slave trader that was wont to cause criminal harm to their cargo of slaves, let alone to deter any effort for the states to continue such importation. And as this continued in its influence to the next presidential election of 1804, I'm happy to report, though 1800 was a contest the likes of which we may never see again, the quaint term landslide was provided to my victory in the presidential election 1804. And two particular states, Connecticut and South Carolina, that continued to welcome the greatest ports of the importation of slaves to our nation, certainly did not care to cast their electoral votes for me. They were two of but a few others that I did not gain. And that's because they knew that the vote of 17 and 84 in our Congress in Annapolis, the result of which was our Northwest Ordinance 85, the Northwest Ordinance 87, had found its way into our Constitution to allow in 20 years' time another opportunity for our nation to vote and finally end the importation of slaves. There's a beginning. And can you imagine, our old enemy England succeeded to end the importation of slaves to her shores in 1807 through the influence of William Wilberforce, with whom I continue to correspond. And therefore, the very next year, the bill was put forth by a senator from North Carolina, Mr. James Turner. James Turner initiated that bill to end the importation of slaves to our nation, voted on by our Congress March the 2nd, 1807, to take its effect the first day of January, 1808. Think of the 40 years, as I certainly have pondered many, many times, near 40 years since my first action in public office in the old House of Burgesses, stand to call for permission to begin a debate towards ending the importation of slaves, that nearly 40 years later, be able to see that final reconciliation and to be able to sign into law on March the 2nd, 1807. Citizens, I do not want to belabor this gathering tonight with my further commentary, with perhaps one exception. and that is to read to you what I understand is the reflection of my good friend John Quincy Adams. The statement that John Quincy Adams entered into his diary on March the 2nd. Imagine this, March the 2nd, 1820. This was after the vote of the Congress to accept a compromise between admitting Maine, our 23rd state, as a free state, and then to admit the territory of Missouri enslaved, to enter our union a year later, this year, 1821, in the summertime. A compromise, citizens, which you know we had already followed for nearly 20 years. The compromise that resulted from those Northwest ordinances, particularly of 87, drawing an imaginary line, 3630, that will admit a northern state, but the next one must come from the south. We have Ohio in my first administration, March 1803, but 9 years later, let us admit Louisiana as our 18th state. And do not forget, I'm rather proud of it, we admitted a Catholic state, allowing them to continue with their parishes and the Napoleonic Code of Law. Oh my, did the pulpits rattle in New England. But then reflect too. Our 19th state comes into our union up north, Indiana. Our 20th state, a year later, comes into the union from the south, Mississippi. Our 21st state then, above 3630, Illinois enters. And then in 19, go south again, and we compromised with admitting Alabama. Here we are, citizens, this year of 1821. I'm happy to read that John Quincy Adams states clearly, the Declaration of Independence not only asserts the natural equality of all men and their unalienable right to liberty, but that the only just power of government is derived from the consent of the governed. A power for one part of the people to make slaves of the other can never be derived from the consent and is therefore not a just power. I have favored this Missouri Compromise, says Adams, believing it to be all that could be effected under the present Constitution, and from extreme unwillingness to put the Union at hazard. But perhaps it would have been a wiser as well as a bolder course to have persisted in the restriction upon Missouri, till it should have terminated in a convention of the states to revise and amend the Constitution. This would have produced a new union of 13 or 14 states unpolluted with slavery, with a great and glorious object to effect, namely, that of rallying to their standard the other states by the universal emancipation of their slaves. If the Union must be dissolved, slavery is precisely the question upon which it ought to break. For the present, however, this contest is now laid asleep. Citizens, lastly, if you will allow, Mr. Adams' statement is very different from what I wrote to the first of two senators in the state of Maine. John Holmes, a former representative of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Upon learning of the Missouri Compromise, I have written, I had for a long time ceased to read newspapers or pay any attention to public affairs, confident that they were in good hands and content to be a passenger in our bark to the shore from which I am not distant. But this momentous question of the Missouri Compromise, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. Oh, it is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. a geographical line coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated. And every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. I can say with conscious truth, there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach in any practicable way. The cession of that kind of property, for it is so misnamed, is a bagatelle which would not cost me a second thought if, in that way, a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected, and gradually, and with due sacrifices. I regret that I am now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 76 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons. And that my only consolation is that I will not live long enough to have to weep over it. If they would but dispassionately weigh the blessings they would throw away against an abstract principle more likely to be affected by union than by schism, they would pause before they would perpetuate this act of suicide on themselves and of treason against the hopes of the world. I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to express my opinion during this near hour. And if there are any questions for me, I would be happy to partake, but otherwise,
mic on, mic
I believe
off.
Mr. Odanino would like to have the individual he was speaking with earlier to comment. So the floor is over, Mr. Odanino. I look to you as a moderator.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We are now going to invite Mr. Barker, whom you referred to earlier, to join us. We certainly thank you for your time and your considerable insights into the history of slavery in the United States. Thank you very much. And now we would welcome Mr. Barker
Mic on.
to join us. And it's my understanding that Mr. Barker will be able to field questions that our audience might have, not only about historical events post 1821, but also any questions that might arise on the comments that we've heard from Mr. Jefferson this evening. Mr. Barker, welcome.
Thank you, Michael, and thank all of you for remaining and listening to essentially what Jefferson himself wrote and reflected upon, because at this time in 1821, Mr. Jefferson was beginning his autobiography. So Mr. Jefferson reflected upon was what he had written and what he had attended to, including that final letter to John Holmes. So remember, this is speaking from Mr. Jefferson's point of view, and now, you know, to speak upon whatever you would like out of context of Mr. Jefferson, I'm happy to pursue. So the floor is open.
You mentioned John Quincy Adams. I believe that you do have some news about John Quincy Adams' writings.
Well, as you heard, the opinions of John Quincy Adams upon the Missouri Compromise and that of Thomas Jefferson were remarkably similar. They are remarkably similar. They both foresaw what this could lead to, that if the Union were going to dissolve and fall apart, it would be over slavery, decidedly over slavery. And they both of them said, what other solution right now than to let it be where it is? So some years later, John Quincy Adams entered into his diary the following comment upon Mr. Jefferson. This was entered into John Quincy Adams' diary in 1831. So we're beginning at that time to see the storms and the tempests of truth throughout the nation. It was going to lead into Jackson's election, the falling apart of the Democratic and Republican Party, the birth of what becomes known as the Democratic Party, and then you're going to see the Whigs grow up out of that. And of course, later on, as you all know, we have the Whigs split, and you see the beginning of the resuscitation of Jeffersonian Republicans, and you see the first candidate, John Fremont, come to bat there in 1856 and not so well supported, and he finds his way to California. But their second candidate in 1860, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. His Cooper Union address, many of his campaign speeches in all honor to Jefferson. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that. But going back to 1831 before Jackson, this is what John Quincy Adams writes, reflecting upon Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson's love of liberty was sincere and ardent, not confined to himself, like that of most of his fellow slaveholders. He was above the
Mic off.
sophistry of the South Carolinian nullifiers, which would make of slavery the cornerstone to the temple of liberty. He saw the gross inconsistency between the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the fact of Negro slavery, and he could not or would not prostitute the faculties of his mind to the vindication of that slavery from which his soul he abhorred. Mr. Jefferson had not the sporting of martyrdom. He would have introduced a flaming denunciation of slavery into the Declaration of Independence, but the discretion of his colleagues fucked it out. He did insert a most eloquent and impassioned argument against it in his notes upon Virginia, but on that very account, the book was published almost against his will. He projected a plan of general emancipation in his revision of the Virginia laws, but finally presented a plan of leaving slavery precisely where it was. And in his memoirs, he leaves a posthumous warning to the planters that they must at no distant day emancipate their slaves, or that worse would follow. But he withheld the publication of his prophecy till he himself should be in the grave.
Anybody that has any questions, then now is the time to take
Mic
advantage.
on.
We do have one question in the chat window here. The question is from Janet. Did Jefferson ever consider emancipating his enslaved people in his will, as Washington did?
Yes, he certainly did, but unlike Washington, who was one of our
Mic off.
presidents and could well afford to do that, as Mr. Jefferson mentioned earlier, he was deep in debt and his slaves were no longer his property to do as he should choose, with a few exceptions, of course. The enslaved family was one, and others who had marked qualifications for making their own livelihood as in being free, crafts, artistries that they could pursue. But no, the only way that that he would ever be able to free his slaves is if he were solvent. The result, of course, is lamentable. They were all sold at the estate sale. Now, Washington, of course, was able to free his slaves, but we forget it was only his slaves. And during the 40 years that Martha and George were married, Martha, the wealthiest widow in all of Virginia, brought with her, some say 3-4 times as many slaves as Washington had inherited. And during their 40 years, they had all intermarried, Washington's and her slaves. So it caused great havoc, if you will, after Washington passed away. So much so that Mrs. Washington was for fear of her life. And she went up to live in the 3rd story of Mount Vernon. In fact, 2 of her slaves ran away. One of them was Oney Judge. And she sought to have Oney Judge captured and brought back to her. So to say simply that George Washington is free from any sort of accusation is not entirely correct. He freed his, weren't many, but he was unable to free all of them at Mount Vernon.
Mic on.
And what was the law, Bill, in Virginia regarding the manumission of slavery during most of Jefferson's life?
The manumission for slavery, you could free any slave, but the slave had to be freed by a deed. You had to draw up a deed legally that pronounced that this individual was freed. That individual would then be able to carry that with them. And furthermore, as you heard Mr. Jefferson remark in that letter, he had a great question, particularly as he grew older. Even with the emancipation of slaves, can we all live together under the same government? He was part of that slave the colony of Monrovia, as James Monroe began to initiate when he became president, an expatriation of slaves because of that great work. And what helped to instigate this amongst a lot of Americans was, of course, the Toussaint Louverture uprising in Haiti and Saint-Domingue. It created a great fear throughout our nation that this could happen amongst us. Now, Gabriel Prosser and the other slave uprising occurred after Jefferson's time. But here's Jefferson hoping that during his time there could be an effort to emancipate and expatriate. This is something where, argued back and forth for those many years, there really was no immediate solution. They abided with it, as you heard both Jefferson and John Quincy Adams.
Mic on.
Right.
There's another question in the chat window also regarding emancipation from Stephanie. Did Jefferson ever consider emancipating his personal slave, Jupiter?
Yes, he did. As a matter of fact, that was discussed. And Jupiter, for whatever reason, stayed with him. Jupiter's cousins, by that I mean the Hemings, also approached. As we know, Sally approached Jefferson about that in France. We know her brother James Hemings approached him on that. After they returned from France, Jefferson did emancipate James Hemings. But Jupiter, no, stayed on, might have had that opportunity had he not fallen ill in late autumn, early winter 1799, as he was driving Jefferson up to Philadelphia for the last session of the government in Philadelphia, that winter of 99 and 1800. Jefferson made sure to provide for him in Fredericksburg, put him up at an inn there and provide blankets for him, and learned only later that Jupiter then felt well enough to go back to Monticello and then seek a cure down at Jefferson's brother's house, Randolph Jefferson, at Snowden down near Scottsville. And it came to pass that he was given a potion, though the term is made, by a Negro doctor who commented, "This will either cure you or kill you." And we're not certain of exactly how his end came about, but he did die within a short time after that at the Randolph Jefferson plantation of Snowden, and evidently was buried there.
Mic on.
Bill, many people here may not be familiar with Monticello, and since you are now the resident Mr. Jefferson there, and I understand Monticello has gone to great lengths to discuss
Mic off.
the life of slaves at Monticello. Could you give us a little insight into what Monticello is like for a visitor today, why it would behoove people to visit, and what are the approaches Monticello is taking to highlight the life of slaves at Monticello during Mr. Jefferson's time?
For the last thank you, Michael. For the last several years, Monticello has conducted daily talks on slavery, right on site, right there along the southeast terraced walkway, where it is believed the rooms for Sally Hemings and some of her family were located. These are every hour, on the hour, and it is an in-depth discussion about slavery in the time and Jefferson's inheritance and Jefferson's attentions to it. And oddly enough, we have Mr. Jefferson to thank because so much of the information, particularly the names of nearly every single slave, and he owned throughout his life nearly 600. That Mr. Jefferson leaves us the names of nearly every one of the slaves, how they were interrelated, what plantations they lived upon. And he owned 5 plantations within the area of Monticello, including Monticello. He owned further farms down in Bedford County, near his retreat house, Poplar Forest. And so for all of those accounts, we have the facts as best we can of certain individuals, what they were employed in pursuing at all of the various farms, again, how they were interrelated, and we talk about these families, the laws at the time, the experiences at the time, and the recognition, as Mr. Jefferson used the word once in our Declaration of American Independence, the consanguinity of the experience, that from the Latin word sanguine, meaning blood, the relationships of this population at that time.
Mic on.
And with respect to the life of the slaves lived at Monticello, how would that compare to slaves in other parts of the United or the colonies at that time, or the country?
Well, Michael, there's no way you can look at degrees of slavery without an ultimate abhorrence to the entire commerce and the entire experience, inherited. I mean, talk about leaving the elements of monarchy, nobility, aristocracy, landed gentry, and particularly abolishing the laws of primogeniture from which Jefferson benefited. This is still inherited. Our nation inherits this. And of course, you know, the founding fathers, I think it was Benjamin Franklin, he said, you know, we didn't create the nation with slavery. Slavery was already there. And it had been there for quite some time. But they knew what they had inherited. And yet, what do you do? What do you do in conducting the nation to simply stay together, to continue to follow the founding principles of union, and to realize that your own Constitution, which protects and defends slavery, the decisions of the Supreme Court protecting and defending slavery, the property thereof, the white male freeholder, 21 years of age or older, 6% of the population having the vote. That's the same population for the most part come 1850 and 1860. It's the recognition that, as abhorrent as this is, where's the answer? Where is the immediate answer? There is no immediate answer. Yes, there are degrees, and you can't deny that. There are two Italian gentlemen, noblemen. The one is Castiglione. I know that from Milan. I can't remember his friend, but they come to visit the United States and travel all through. They're abhorred by slavery. They just have grown the greatest distaste for it. But yet they do remark that amongst the more beneficent and attentive masters are Washington, Madison, and Jefferson. But even that is an excuse. It's still an excuse as we look back on it today. But you know, the interesting thing we have to realize, and this is where history is such a great teacher, because Jefferson believed it's the first and foremost subject. We have to know where we've been to have a better understanding where we are. And particularly in these days, as we're bringing to the surface more and more systemic racism, yeah, it was when Jefferson was born. But, you know, these are things that we still deal with, and yet we need to realize we have the benefit in history because we know what happened. We know what happened. But the point is, they knew no more of what was going to happen on the 28th of April, 1821, than we know what's going to happen tomorrow. So what are they going to say about us in another 100, 200 years? What are we doing right now? Who is keeping silent about something that they know in their heart and their conscience is ultimately destructive of the human soul, let alone society? What are we doing? I believe it was David McCullough who made a stunning remark. No one has ever lived in the past. And I think that can help. I think the discussion helps. It certainly helps visitors to Monticello to sit there right on the spot and to hear these stories and to get an idea of the time. Particularly my job, to put things in a context, to provide, if you will, a clearer picture of 1821. Who would want to go back? But then to realize, you know, it is people like Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Madison, who set that mold and opened it up to the future for us, the living, to do something about it. That's Jefferson. The earth belongs to the living generation. The dead hold no power over us. So I'm sorry to ramble, Michael, but it is something that's very much in the heart and soul of all of us at Monticello, to tell these stories and to act them, certainly as I do, no matter how offensive they may be. And it's very tough at times.
What was Jefferson's famous comment about slavery and a wolf?
You know, he was a great classicist. He loved the classics. He often referred to himself as an antique Roman. And that was a statement originally written by Publius Sirius with respect to slavery in the ancient Roman world, in the Roman Republic. But see, the difference is slavery was not recognized by race or color. In fact, slaves were voluntary. They were artists and teachers, men of scientific curiosity who would put themselves into slavery as a support. Now, the foundation of the laws of slavery, as the British jurist Baron von Puffendorf emphasized, is force and war, whereby a victor can subjugate those they defeated and hold them as slaves. Yes, there was that in the Roman world. But Publius Sirius said of the extent of slavery in that time, with respect to the small number of freeholders, actual citizens in Rome, that it's like holding a wolf by the ear. You know, we often misinterpret it or misquote and say a wolf by the ears. No, think of it even more profound. Holding a wolf by the ear that you can ne'er let go, let alone hold on to. Your self-preservation is in the one hand and justice is in the other. So there it is in Jefferson's world for those born into slavery and continuing to be beholden to it, and continuing to watch the nation divide over it. 36-30.
Yeah, we've got another.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, we've got another question in the chat window, and if you do have other questions, please put it into either the chat window or to be able to unmute yourself on the mic so that you can ask the question directly. So there's another question from Janet in here. It says, how did you initially get interested in portraying a Jefferson?
Janet, I got interested by, I suppose, being a generation removed. My father was 62 years old when I was born. He was born in 1894, and he was the grandson of Confederate veterans. He was born in a house that was built by my direct male ancestor back in 1763. And when we would visit all our relations down in North Carolina, it hadn't changed much since the days of the Civil War. The roads were all dirt. I used to ask my father, does this look like it does now when you were a boy? He said, it looked this way before the Civil War. I used to ask my granddaddy the same question, and he said it looked the same for him. This is in the turn of the century, 1900. My mother was born in 1910 in Philadelphia, where she witnessed horse and carriages. She was 8 years old when the Spanish flu came through. I wish I had listened to her more, but I remember her talking about people masking up and being so very worried about it. So there you are, Janet. It's that being a generation removed. And when my father would talk about the war, he was talking about the Civil War. And he was in World War I, but the war still meant the Civil War. My mother's father saw Lincoln in his coffin when he was brought to Philadelphia and laid out in Independence Hall. So I grew up with these stories. And quite naturally, I was a history major. I loved telling stories, as my parents did. I went into theater work, and pretty soon, a friend of mine who portrayed William Penn, he was a teacher in the 4th grade public school system where they teach Pennsylvania history. He walked into the classroom dressed as Penn, and he came up to me and said, did anyone ever tell you looked like Jefferson? This was 1980. And I had long red hair, was rather ginky, and I said, what are you talking about, Carl? His name was Carl Gatter. He said, they need one at Independence Hall for photo ops and celebrations. He said, you'd love it. You're a historian. He said, maybe you could answer some questions, but you'd learn. So that's how it started. And I never looked back. Within a year or two, I was getting invitations elsewhere. And I moved away from the stage because this was something that just fascinated me. I've never turned and looked back. And I have to say, Jefferson has never, ever been boring. In my opinion, he continues to be relevant to everything that goes on. His vision is astounding, and his defaults are astounding because they're very human. When you realize we're all caught in our times. You know, what can we foresee in the future? What will happen? So thank you, Jenna, for the question, but it's been an extraordinary livelihood.
Any other questions for the chat or to be able to unmute yourself? If you have any, that would be the time to ask.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for bringing your nonpareil interpretation of Mr. Jefferson for us and the wonderful insights into the history of slavery in America, as well as your own personal commentaries. We've greatly appreciated. I'm sure I speak for the entire audience when I say we're very grateful for you taking the time. I know it's getting even later there tonight, but you're back east, and we thank you for taking the time to do that. And so we will bid you adieu with a great boatload of appreciation for your efforts and your talents that you were so generous to share with us this evening.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you. I want to thank you, David, and I want to thank all of you in your noble efforts, truly, to preserve the story of our American Civil War, so that, again, we can remember where we've been, to watch out, you know, for where we are. It's an extraordinary story. So thank you for letting me be part of our discussion here tonight.
There's a final commentary in the chat that I just want to be able to share. It says, I'm very glad to see Mr. Barker. I lived in Charlottesville for 4 years, but always miss seeing him there. So thank you very much, and I think we can end on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.